Absolute Joker is the most serious person in the Absolute Justice League, because instead of being composed of characters like Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, the Absolute Justice League is made up of all the main Absolute villains like Joker, Ra's al Ghul, Eleanor Thawne, and more. Now, initially our issue reveals that a lot of heroes in this universe are corrupt and traitors, because it picks up at a board meeting back in 1951 with a group of people known as the Un-American Activities Committee listening to Hawkman express that the fellow heroes he was working with in the JLA were a bunch of commie rats, and he was willing to tell them anything they wanted to know about them, even at the cost of revealing his own secret identity. Our story then jumps over to Oliver Queen talking to Roy Harper while practicing his shot with a bow and arrow inside of the Arrow Cave's archery range. And after nailing 2 bullseyes with ease and joking around with Roy for a little bit, Ollie decided to take a break by heading over to his garage, where he then expressed that this new cave of his had everything he needed, because on top of the custom archery range, it was also outfitted with an unbelievable computer setup and a convertible with ejector seats that he designed himself. And while we don't get to hear Roy's side of the conversation, it's safe to assume that he eventually tells Ollie that he's kind of concerned with what Ollie's doing, because apparently the main reason that he acquired this new cave and everything inside of it was so he could stop a man named Jubal Slade who was trafficking kids to a private island and getting away with it because he was paying off cops and paying off the court system. But despite Roy strongly suggesting that he stay out of this out of fear that Ollie was gonna get hurt, Ollie's mind had already been made, expressing that there wasn't any point to having a bunch of money if he wasn't gonna try to use it to try making a difference in the world. Our story then goes over to an undisclosed facility with Hector Hammond, an absolute Green Lantern villain, talking to Jubal Slade himself on the phone while making his way to an important meeting. And knowing that Ollie was coming after him, Jubal was overcome by fear and concern. But Hammond was certain he had nothing to worry about, stating that this whole situation would go away in a month when they offered Ollie a bribe of $5 million. Once their conversation was over though, Hammond would enter a room where he was greeted by Veronica Kell from the Absolute Wonder Woman series, Absolute Joker and Ra's al Ghul, and Eleanor Thawne from Absolute Flash. And once Hammond took a seat, everybody realized that he wasn't taking things serious upon requesting a macchiato. So Ra's al Ghul quickly shut down his sarcastic and witty nature, indicating that the room they were in was not for playing games. It was a room where they didn't speak unless they were speaking of work, which was something that Eleanor Thawne agreed with because she was firm in the belief that time was their greatest asset, so they shouldn't be wasting such a precious thing on his little jokes. And that's when the Joker decided to chime in as well, agreeing with his fellow allies before stating that he wasn't a person who enjoyed jokes. Nevertheless, eventually it was time for Veronica Kell to address why they were holding this meeting in the first place, that reason being the new Absolute heroes. Because for the first time in history, the system of power in this world was being threatened by people who not only rebelled against the status quo, but people who couldn't be bought and people who couldn't be bribed. When their system was challenged by heroes and outliers in the past, it wasn't a problem because heroes like Wildcat and Hawkman eventually agreed to step down when offered massive lump sums of money. And even when heroes like Iron Monroe and the Sandman didn't accept the money, they were killed. Throughout their history, there had been 300 examples of people acting outside of the status quo, but in one way or another, these people were eventually dealt with. But now they were dealing with people like Wonder Woman, a being that was raised in hell who was so incredibly powerful that she deafened an entire city before turning the Tetracide into stone. And there were also people like Absolute Superman and Absolute Batman, one who was violently disrupting Lazarus Corp operations and the other who was slowly taking over Gotham by building his resources into the city. They were powerful, determined, extremely resilient, and refused to accept bribes in exchange for stepping down. After explaining the danger of the Absolute Trinity though, Veronica then expressed that unfortunately this rebellious opposing force didn't stop with them because there were also 3 other beings who threatened their power as well: Absolute Flash, Absolute Green Lantern, and Absolute Martian Manhunter. But the most concerning thing about these outliers wasn't their vast array of powers and capabilities, it was actually how they could influence the people around them, because if this sort of behavior wasn't corrected and corrected very soon, then others would be inspired to join their side and fight for their cause. In fact, there were already multiple indicators that this uprising was happening. Peacekeeper agents like Lois Lane were ignoring protocol, Wonder Woman was commanding military officers during the Gateway event, and seasoned officers like Jim Gordon's daughter refused to take down Batman when they had the chance. Previously, these sorts of threats could be dealt with individually with their private and government resources, but Veronica was now more than certain that that was no longer possible, stating that if they weren't willing to pool all their resources together, then these monsters monsters were gonna tear their world apart. Despite realizing what was going on though, Hector Hammond claimed that he wasn't really scared, stating that he never needed help dealing with him and his friends' problems in the past, and that the new emerging heroes would be dealt with by the system the same way that they were always dealt with. But wanting to prove that they could help him deal with his problems even faster, Veronica would then call in Hawkman into the room, who was literally carrying Oliver Queen's lifeless body over his shoulder before hurling him onto the table. Ra's al Ghul would then express that that was how they handled problems around here, not in a month, but in a single day. However, despite such a horrifying showcase of power, Eleanor Thawne didn't believe that forming an alliance was necessary either, indicating that she didn't see the need to be in each other's pockets, before also pointing out that none of them were friends. However, that's when Joker asked if he could take the floor to say a few words, because him and a team at his particle physics laboratory had recently made quite the interesting discovery. But if what he was about to tell them was ever spoken about to anyone outside of the room they were in, then they were gonna have some serious problems. Nevertheless, he then go on to explain that there was something referred to as the God particle that they used to consider as the final puzzle piece in quantum mechanics, the piece that confirmed how the universe worked. But last year, him and his team realized that everybody was wrong, discovering an even greater particle called the Omega particle that had a spiritual and moral dimension to it and was responsible for forming the basic building blocks of all creation. Eleanor Thawne was skeptical that he was telling the truth though, stating that he couldn't be serious if he wanted them to believe that there was actually a subatomic particle that was capable of understanding good and evil. But as reminded by Ra's al Ghul, the Joker wasn't the type to joke around, so they needed to take him more seriously and listen to what he was saying. After that, the Joker would continue explaining his discovery, stating that the fundamental forces of this universe trended in one direction and that there was a moral gravity keeping everything in its place. So the fact that they were all in positions of power was not by chance or accident, but instead by design. The world was just and they had evidence to prove it, but there were people trying to destroy the natural order of things that was established by a greater power. And obviously all of us know that that greater power is Darkseid. Nevertheless, the Joker would then proceed to emphasize that they needed to fight against the injustice brought by the new heroes. They didn't need to be friends, but they needed to be allies to ensure that the moral arc of the universe bended towards justice. And it's here that it's revealed that the facility where they were holding the meeting was actually at the Hall of Justice, as the Joker then proposed a toast to their newly formed Justice League. After that, we go over to Brainiac and Mirror Master though, who were actually analyzing the meeting the entire time, and while Brainiac was confident that this team would work well with each other because their different personalities and preferences balanced everything out, he felt like they needed one more person to make the Justice League complete, which is when none other than absolute Lex Luthor received a call from the Justice League. But sadly, that's where this issue comes to an end, but if you want to see what happens with the Absolute Universe next, let me know in the comments down below.